Hi there. Welcome to Jack's Melancholy Palace, a YouTube channel in which this guy talks about fictional video game lawyers a little too much. If you're watching this video, you're probably one of 3 people. Maybe you've completed the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. Perhaps you've partially completed the game. Or maybe you haven't finished it at all. In light of this, I'm going to give ample warning before I speak about anything regarding story spoilers or characters. But before we get to that, let me give you a little bit of background on Ace Attorney as a series. Ace Attorney is a murder mystery puzzle-solving visual novel, so even though some folks might not care about spoilers, in my opinion, the series is best experienced with as little knowledge as possible. I didn't make this video as fast as possible, not that I ever do, because I wanted to give fans enough time to play through the game themselves before posting something on a social forum that will allow us to really discuss it. Nevertheless, I'm aware that there'll probably be quite a few people who haven't played the game. For those people, I'm going to give a general outline of the Great Ace Attorney, and that should give you enough information to decide if this is the kind of game you want to experience. The biggest reason why this is being posted now though is because I needed to give myself time to sit with my feelings regarding the Great Ace Attorney. I had a lot of complicated feelings about the game when I first finished it. I needed to reflect on those and play through the game again. Now I've done those things and I feel confident to make this video. Then let's delay no longer. This is the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, published by Capcom in 2021 for multiple platforms, produced by Shutakumi. Previous entries in the Ace Attorney series have all taken place in a vague near-future 21st century Japan. That is unless you play the English localization of Phoenix Wright, which suggests that the story takes place in California, complete with traditional American mountain villages. Aside from changing one of the lead character's favorite foods from ramen to hamburgers, this change, at least in my opinion, doesn't affect the overall narrative, although analyzing these changes would certainly be interesting to do another time. What's relevant is that the Great Ace Attorney, whether you play it in Japanese or English, completely ignores prior localizations, keeping the character names practically the same, and seeing you take the role of Ryunosuke Naruhodo, a relative of Phoenix Wright, who goes to London during the turn of the 20th century, and ends up becoming a lawyer. Frankly, it would be quite difficult to spin the game taking place anywhere else, or any time else. Themes of nationalism, racism, and real-world events are prevalent throughout the story. It's also not a stretch to say that Phoenix Wright in the English canon didn't have Japanese relatives, as the details of his biological family members are hardly ever touched upon. Also, what a localization this is. The translation team went above and beyond to make characters talk and sound like people who existed in the early 20th century. Character dialogue may even have native English speakers questioning what certain words mean. As a British person from London myself, I was surprised to see how well the era of English language was represented. Despite the obvious connection between protagonists, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles barely has anything to do with the original games. You can go in without playing any of them. There are a few references here and there for long-term fans, but nothing at all that will take you out of the experience. So assuming you know nothing else about the game, allow me to give you a spoiler-free review to determine if this is something you'd be interested in. Upon arriving in London, Ryunosuke Naruhodo finds himself involved in several cryptic cases and multifaceted mysteries, surrounded by a cast of colorful characters. If there's one thing the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles does best, it's character. Everyone you meet is incredibly memorable and unique. Ace Attorney is a series famous for its quirky witnesses, however they would be a little hit or miss sometimes, devolving into one-note single-serving acquaintances, usually having a single gimmick or trope they tend to repeat ad nauseum. Somehow in this game though, even people you don't spend a great deal of time with leave a big impression. Their mannerisms, dialogue, and views on the matters at hand will keep you captivated. Even when you think you understand how a character is probably going to react to something, they'll surprise you, and that intrigue will keep you hooked. You're going to need a good attention span though. This game is quite long, akin to reading a rather wordy novel. One of the game's flaws that I'd like to highlight while it's relevant is the pacing. Unfortunately, the text speed tends to drag, even if you enable settings for the fastest dialogue boxes possible. There is a feature to have the text scroll automatically, however, you'll still find yourself mashing the A button to get through tedious conversations at times. However, this pacing is a bit of a double-edged sword. It allows the game to build tension and suspense, which is incredibly cathartic to have pay off. The difficulty of the cases will probably depend on the person. If you are a seasoned Ace Attorney veteran or a fan of murder mysteries in general, the cases may not leave you in shock and awe. For the uninitiated, Ace Attorney is a series in which you are a defense lawyer who must cross-examine what witnesses say with evidence in your court record, to point out contradictions and defend your client from a guilty verdict. At its best, the game can make you feel like a genius, and at its worst, have you thinking, how does that make any sense? While I believe case difficulty can be subjective, the best puzzles are the ones which give you all the pieces and let you come to that aha moment yourself. I'm pleased to report that the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles has several of these ecstatic moments. One of this entry's unique additions takes place during the investigation sections. While previous games had you searching for clues in rather static environments, with the exception of the newer games, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles introduces the world's greatest detective, Mr. Sherlock. Oh, excuse me. Just a moment. Mr. Sherlock Sholmes. Now, in the Japanese release, he is called Sherlock. However, I assume Capcom didn't want to take any chances with the legal limbo the Sherlock Holmes franchise has been in for some time. Regardless, he still lives on Baker Street, and is still a famous detective. With him, you'll see yourself breaking down scenes and witnesses in a truly spectacular dance of deduction. These segments are a welcome addition. They add some flair to the investigations, making them a lot more enthralling than before. If I'm being honest, they're style over substance though. The solutions don't change your mind a great deal, but I don't think that was the intention. Great deductions are fun ways of making the player privy to insightful information. I mentioned earlier that the best cases make you feel like a genius, and these moments certainly deliver on that. While most of these cases have self-contained stories, there is an overarching narrative throughout the game. I believe that the best Ace Attorney entries tend to have a bigger mystery running alongside events. So do I think the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles has a gripping story overall? For a visual novel, some would argue that this is pivotal. Well, I'll say this much for now. If you enjoy any of the other Ace Attorney games, you are bound to like a lot of what this one has to offer. Whether you see it through to the end will be decided by your own ability to tolerate a lot of long, drawn-out moments, which, to their credit, do pay off in spades. Sometimes. You're probably detecting that I don't feel entirely positive about my experience with the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. And that's because I can't. In fact, the game has left me beside myself, unsure about my feelings as a whole. I meant what I said about the characters, and for what it's worth, the animations and music are absolutely phenomenal, some of the best in the whole series. Despite finishing the game a year ago, it's still hard to put into words exactly how I feel about it. Nevertheless, that's what I'm going to attempt to do here. If anything, this video will help me figure that out once and for all. I know that I enjoyed my time with the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, yet I can't deny that there was a small dose of disappointment, I suppose? To discuss those mixed feelings, I'm going to have to get into spoilers. So consider this your final warning. I want to reiterate, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is a fun adventure. It is bound to resonate with a lot of people, but it might not resonate with everyone. Honestly though, if you've never played an Ace Attorney game before, I recommend starting with the first one. It's available practically everywhere, and if you like what that game has to offer, you're more than likely going to enjoy the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, so go and check that out instead. So, without further ado, let's get into... Well, as you can see, I've dressed for the occasion, and as such, may as well propose a toast to it too. Don't worry, it's just grape juice. I was actually quite surprised when I found out that even in the Japanese version of Apollo Justice, Hobo Wright was enjoying a refreshing bottle of grape juice. I suppose maybe they wanted it to be wine, but perhaps they had to call it grape juice to avoid censorship even in their home country. I'm not sure, but cheers. That's pretty good. It's not bad. Do you know how many people commented with, "How do you know he's a hobo? He's not homeless. Why do you call him Hobo Phoenix?" I didn't call him Hobo Phoenix. Blame the Ace Attorney community for over a decade of labels, and it's not worth getting into in this video. If it looks like you're living out of your office and your clothes are hanging from the ceiling, whether you're shacked up with a roommate or whatever, in my opinion, you're not exactly living well off. It doesn't matter. Let's get on with it. While it might be a cliché at this point in the series to have a case revolving around a main character being accused of murder, the Great Ace Attorney starts off strong, with Ryunosuke being accused of killing Professor John H. Wilson, a British national from the UK. Fortunately, Ryunosuke's childhood friend Kazuma Asogi stands up to defend him, as he recently became a defense attorney. Kazuma plans to study law in the UK, however his motivations are somewhat vague. The first case does a good job at establishing the mechanics of the game and introducing us to Ryunosuke's personality. He's a great deal more conflict-averse than Phoenix, at least from the get-go. Over the course of the two games, we see Ryunosuke find the courage to stand up for himself and other people. However, his initial outing portrays him as a deer caught in headlights, exaggerated superbly by the game's stellar animations. Ryunosuke and Kazuma face off against series staple Case 1 prosecutor Mr. Auchi, or at least another relative of his. The defense manages to counter all of the prosecution's claims, until one Giselle Brett is summoned to the stand. Ryunosuke and Kazuma soon realize that she's behind the murder, however lack a critical clue connecting her to the victim. That's until Susato Mikotoba makes a sudden appearance with a key piece of evidence. Now, unfortunately we have to stop right here. I'm assuming if you've watched this far into the video that you've played a fair share of Ace Attorney cases. If not, then a welcome to the club, I suppose. Now, witnesses showing up with pivotal evidence is something that tends to happen now and again, for better or worse. And I don't believe the series does it so often as to undermine the stories or gameplay. However, I want you to keep this in mind going forward, as it will become relevant later. Ryunosuke and Kazuma eventually get Miss Brett to confess her crime, however it's not clear why she did it. Plus the British government requests her to be sent to China in order to be tried in a British court. It's all a little sketchy. Kazuma acknowledges Ryunosuke's knack for being a defense attorney and said he wants to ask him a favor. The case ends there and is, in my opinion, a pretty decent start to the story. Case 2 takes an immediately surprising turn, not having a trial at all, but entirely taking place on a ship. Kazuma's favor turns out to be a plea for Ryunosuke to join him on his trip to the UK. Not having the proper authorization, Kazuma opts to stow Ryunosuke away in a trunk. Little did they know, this voyage would prove to be tragic. Ryunosuke wakes up handcuffed in the closet and is uncovered by a charismatic blonde gentleman, who introduces himself as Herlock Sholmes. Before they can become properly acquainted, both Sholmes and Susato accuse Ryunosuke of murder. The murder of Kazuma Asogi, who has been struck down dead. This revelation isn't just shocking, but mirrors case 2 of the first Phoenix Wright game. It's a I should have seen it coming moment for fans, despite not wanting to believe it. In the short time we got to know him, Kazuma proved to be kind, dependable, and just. His death feels like the world has lost a truly just soul. Ryunosuke, feeling as much, would eventually go on to take possession of Kazuma's family sword, known as Karuma, and vow to learn what it means to be a lawyer on his behalf. Ryunosuke shows little interest in being a lawyer during Chapter 1, but it's only through standing up for his best friend that he finds it in himself to realize his potential, and as an individual who can defend others. Similarly to how Phoenix was attending an art university until he heard that his childhood friend Miles Edgeworth had become a ruthless demon prosecutor. I think both games have a very strong message. If we look out for the people we love, they'll be there for us, and we can always realize our own potential. Another character who soon becomes a close friend of Ryunosuke is the world's greatest detective, Herlock Sholmes. In one of his most unique appearances yet, Sholmes starts off coming across as a fraud or a buffoon. He accuses Ryunosuke of being a Russian fugitive, despite bearing no resemblance, and makes absolutely wild assertions. His prestige as a world-famous detective gives credit to his otherwise baseless conjecture. This is an intriguing way to subvert the expectations of the player. We assume Sholmes is going to be incredibly perceptive and intelligent. However, he initially comes across as a trickster. The more time we spend with him though, the more we realize that Herlock understands a lot more than he lets on. In fact, it wouldn't be a stretch to assume he probably figured out a great deal of the case prior to meeting him. By playing dumb, he not only buys time to investigate the surroundings of the corrupt crew, but he also tests Ryunosuke and Susato's wits, proverbially measuring them up for future events. There's also an element of him testing people for his own amusement. There's a sense that he gets a kick out of watching other people untangle lines of logic, lines which probably appear naturally to him. The dances of deduction are his way of entertaining himself while educating those around him. I really like this take on the character. Across both games, I don't think there was a scene in which I was disappointed to interact with Sholmes. His interactions with everyone were always delightful, and I think he makes the investigation sections a lot more tolerable. Ryunosuke, Susato, and Sholmes eventually discover that Kazuma's death was somewhat of an accident, caused by a Russian ballerina called Pavlova, attempting to flee Russia. While trying to find her runaway cat, she bumped into Kazuma. Assuming he was going to turn her in, she pushed him, causing him to collapse and strike a bedpost. She admits to the crime and is taken into custody in the UK. With his innocence proven, Ryunosuke and Susato mourn the loss of Kazuma. This is cut short, however, by Sholmes convincing the two of them to study law in England, suggesting that Ryunosuke should study law for the remainder of the voyage. Reflecting on how passionate Kazuma was to become a lawyer, Ryunosuke agrees to take his place with Susato, promising to be the best legal assistant he could ask for. Overall, the characters carry the case and it doesn't feel too monotonous. The samey locations of the ship get a little dull after a while, but it doesn't take away from the major revelations of the case. The third case begins with Ryunosuke and Susato finally arriving in London and becoming acquainted with Mayo Strongheart, the Lord Chief Justice. A character who bears absolutely no resemblance to anyone else in the Ace Attorney series. Lord Strongheart wishes to test Ryunosuke's abilities as a lawyer and assigns him a case immediately, defending a rich businessman famous for his charitable donations, Magnus Magilded. He's accused of murdering a bricklayer in the back of an omnibus, a sort of taxi. With the entire second case consisting of investigations, the third doesn't hesitate to jump straight into courtroom proceedings, introducing Ryunosuke to not only the UK's jury system, but the game's main prosecutor, Barak Van Zeeks. I absolutely adore Van Zeeks, known across London as the Reaper of the Bailey. Defendants prosecuted by him would always end up dying regardless of their innocence. His mannerisms, wit, and professionalism make him an intimidating foe and a worthy opponent. He appears to be particularly prejudiced against Japanese people. I'm glad that the Great Ace Attorney doesn't shy away from mature topics, and we learn later on that his disdain for Nipponese is rooted in personal trauma. The jury-style cross-examination system, introduced in Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright, returns. This time, a little more polished, and is still quite fun. The jurors themselves are bursting with character, although they come across as a little one-dimensional at times. These sections aren't exactly the most challenging, however that doesn't take away from the satisfaction of proving them wrong and slowly changing their minds. Case Free does something I was surprised and delighted to see. While other Ace Attorney games have dabbled from time to time with the idea that your client might not be innocent, Ryunosuke and Susato begin to realize that Mr. McGilded might not be telling the whole truth. Before they can press him further though, the courtroom is attacked with smoke grenades, causing an immediate recess. Upon returning, the court determines that the person responsible for the smoke was one Gina Lestrade, a pickpocket right out of the gutters of London town. Gina is another great character. They did an especially excellent job with her low-class dialect. She's complicated because she doesn't know how to trust people. Given her life circumstances, it shouldn't be surprising. Ryunosuke manages to convince the court of McGilded's innocence, however can't help pointing out that the omnibus in which the murder took place appears to have been tampered with during the smoke bomb commotion. The defense finds themselves in a predicament. Does Ryunosuke stay put and accept his victory, standing up for his own client and securing his freedom? Or does he pursue the truth, possibly causing his own client to be labeled as guilty? It's an idea I was surprised to see introduced so early in Ryunosuke's story. Yet it's a strong one. Ryunosuke lingers on what it means to be a defense attorney for the remainder of his story, as a result of this trial. In his closing statement, the defense remarks that McGilded could be guilty. However, it's too late. The judge announces his not guilty verdict, and all parties are left with a feeling of despair. McGilded doesn't get long to celebrate his victory before he's summoned to the court by someone to inspect the omnibus. Gina remarks on how much she hates adults, but is taken away by a mysterious girl. Mysterious girls tend to hang around courtrooms often, it seems. The case ends on a shocking note, as it appears McGilded is locked inside the omnibus, which catches fire and is set ablaze. We see Van Zeeks watch with a vague look on his face. It's difficult to determine what he makes of this. I enjoyed Case Free. It was refreshing to focus on a trial, and the events which transpired had me wondering what I would do in Ryunosuke's shoes. Could I defend someone knowing that they are potentially a monster? It's something that Mr. Naruhodo will have to come to terms with as well. Lord Strongheart, being quite impressed with Ryunosuke's defense, immediately asks him to take over another case, in which we are introduced to Tobias Gregson, a no-nonsense police inspector who comes across as gruff and serious. He perpetually munches on fish and chips like any true Brit does, and the animations always make me hungry. I haven't had a proper portion of fish and chips in over 6 years. It is legitimately one of the only things I miss about the UK. The fish and chips in Japan are... let's just say they leave a lot to be desired. Gregson fills us in that a woman has been stabbed in the back, and the suspect is a Japanese man called Natsume Souseki. Now, in a rare case for the Ace Attorney franchise, Natsume Souseki was actually a real guy who visited England in the early 20th century on behalf of Japan to study English literacy. In reality, he had a miserable time due to not having a lot of money and being rather lonely. He wrote, "The 2 years I spent in London were the most unpleasant years in my life. Among English-speaking gentlemen, I lived in misery, like a poor dog that had strayed among a pack of wolves." The Natsume Soseki depicted in this case claims that the woman suddenly screamed and collapsed dead right before his eyes, and that he had nothing to do with her incident. In this case, we finally get to spend some time in Baker Street. The look of 221B is gorgeous. There are a lot of Easter eggs for fans of the original stories. We're also formally introduced to Iris Wilson, an optimistic, whimsical child genius being taken care of by Mr. Sholmes. It's apparent that his knack for deduction has rubbed off on the girl, and in some ways, she might have a keener eye than even the great detective himself. Iris reveals that she is the author behind Herlock's world-famous adventures, using the pen name John Wilson, and basing them off the writings of Herlock's former partner. We realize that the John Wilson murdered in Case 1 is not only likely to be Herlock's former partner, but also Iris's father. She believes that he'll come back someday, although Herlock doesn't tend to reveal a lot about him to her. This revelation kept me intrigued. I always became a little nervous when the subject of Iris's father came up. It wasn't easy to imagine how she'd react to the truth. It's not like the Ace Attorney series has had any other long-running secret family relationships unbeknownst to the people involved. Certainly no plot lines that have yet to be resolved after 15 years. Like Case 2, deductions in this case were fun, however the pacing tended to drag. Ugh. If you're tired of the whole life thing, take a shot every time I mention bad pacing in this review. You'll be right as rain by the end of it, I'm sure. It's revealed that the victim was accidentally struck in the back by a knife falling out of a window as a result of a couple having a domestic. Coincidentally, the culprit herself happened to be summoned as one of the jurors. Now in reality, jury members are supposed to be randomly chosen members of the public who can offer an impartial take on the case. The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles on several occasions either has jury members who are connected in more ways than one, or possess some incredibly specific and/or pivotal knowledge. I'm willing to look past this though and suspend my disbelief, as it makes the game more interesting, and it would be pretty dull if every jury member didn't have much else to offer. The last case of the first game picks up 2 months later. During that time, Ryunosuke and Susato have been living with Sholmes and Iris. The slice of life scenes between them are incredibly charming. I could honestly watch these characters interact with each other for ages. Herlock is angry that the violin he obtained from a pawnbroker's is actually a viola, so heads down to confront the owner. A portly gentleman called Windy Banks, who is established to be a somewhat cowardly character, brandishing a pistol with a single bullet, reserved to kill himself at any moment. How quirky. Another man shows up calling himself Egid Benedict, asking to retrieve a coat and a disc he supposedly deposited. People who make deposits are given a password, and have to retrieve their goods within 2 months, otherwise they'll go on sale. Gina Lestrade shows up again, and gets into a fight with Eggert about who the coat belongs to. Using deductive reasoning, the Baker Street gang prove Eggert to be rotten. With lies. Outed, he decides to pull out a gun and try to murk everyone. Fortunately, Gregson murk everyone. Such a great phrase. Fortunately, Gregson shows up to arrest him and save the day, taking the disc and mentioning that all of this has something to do with a much bigger case. Herlock, being the trickster he is, manages to imprint a copy of the disc into a bar of caramel. Back at Baker Street, everyone discusses the case over dinner. And on the subject of cases, Susato brings up one of Sholmes' classics, The Hound of the Baskervilles. Iris is shocked that Susato is familiar with the case, given it was never published. Herlock adds that the manuscript is locked up in Windy Banks' pawnbroker. Iris appears to be a little dejected that Sholmes is holding on to it, and Gina notices this. She still doesn't trust adults, not even the great Herlock Sholmes, so decides to attempt to break in at Windy Banks to retrieve the manuscript. Unfortunately, things don't go down all that well. Sholmes wakes up everyone, noticing that the lights are still on at Windy Banks. they arrive to find a shadowy figure who takes a shot hitting Herlock. To make matters worse, Gina is discovered unconscious in the back room with the body of Mr. Windy Banks. Things really kick off in this case, and I was quite enthralled with the events which transpired. With Sholmes incapacitated, Ryunosuke gets to do some investigating with Iris, looking for evidence to prove Gina's innocence. To make matters worse, Strongheart informs Susato that her father is sick and she best return to Japan as soon as possible. One of the more impactful sections of the case is Ryunosuke approaching Gina to take up her defense. From being in the defendant's chair himself to standing up for a fellow foreigner in a strange land, even taking into account his experience defending the corrupt Magnus McGilded, it becomes apparent that Ryunosuke has learned how to trust his clients and stand up for them when no one else will. Gina is moved by his determination to defend her to the bitter end, and I felt it was quite a powerful moment between them. Ryunosuke reveals that the one responsible for the death of Windy Banks was none other than Egad Benedict, whose real name is Ashley Graydon. Mr. Graydon was working for the British government, relaying sensitive information, and was bribed by Magnus McGilded to steal said info. Ashley's father, concerned for his son's safety getting involved with such a figure, confronted McGilded, only to be murdered by him. Mr. Graydon was responsible for McGilded's death following Case 3, seeking revenge for his father. In an attempt to retrieve the disc containing secret government information, he ended up in a shootout which took the life of Mr. Windy Banks. When it's revealed that Magnus McGilded was indeed guilty, there's an uproar regarding Ryunosuke's defense. Despite this though, Ryunosuke concedes that his previous client was likely guilty, and that he's willing to accept the consequences. It's truly inspiring to see him take responsibility for almost letting a despicable man get away with everything he did. Being a rookie attorney, it's natural Ryunosuke could be manipulated so easily, but to see him learn and grow from it was fantastic, even if it meant losing his ability to practice law. Gina is found not guilty, and Van Zieks comments that he's impressed by Ryunosuke's resolve. Furthermore, he hints that the reason he despises Japanese people is because a Japanese person once betrayed him in some way before, something we're bound to learn about later. As Susato prepares to set sail back to Japan, there is one last reveal. The disc from the case was playing a message in Morse code. A message spelling several names: J. Wilson, T. Gregson, A. Shin, and K. Asogi. This raises more questions, but before any of it can be addressed, the game comes to an end. Now, Ace Attorney has had storylines between entries before, but never to an extent such as this. And that's one of my problems with the Great Ace Attorney adventures. It sets up so many interesting characters and stories, but then ends rather abruptly. It's not a big issue if you're playing both games back to back, but I'm not sure how each entry stands on their own. With the original Ace Attorney series, you could play almost any game without context of the others and still get quite an intriguing story. Here, I'm not sure that's the case. The Great Ace Attorney Adventures leaves us with the following questions. Who was John Wilson and why did that British lady murder him? Why was his name alongside Asogi's and Gregson's on a disc pertaining sensitive UK government information? What was Asogi's true motive for going to the UK? Who betrayed Van Zieks to make him hate the Japanese? Why is Herlock so secretive about the Hound of the Baskervilles manuscript? How did Susato know the title if she couldn't have possibly seen it before? What will become of Susato's father and why has he suddenly fallen ill? How much does Iris really know about her dad? The game expects you to take a lot of these points of interest and keep them in mind. And while it's certainly doable, it's a lot to take in, especially if you're waiting 2 years between each game. So in conclusion, I think the Great Ace Attorney sets up a lot of really interesting premises and introduces a lot of really entertaining characters. However, it moves at a glacial pace. So many key narrative points are introduced to you, and even if you play Daigyakkuten Saiban 1 and 2 back to back, it's a lot to keep track of. Speaking of which, I suppose we should get into the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles Resolve, aka Daigyakkuten Saiban 2. Hang on for just a second. Do you like the music of the Ace Attorney series? I really love the themes during the Dances of Deduction. Dances of Deduction. They're really good. Here, check this out. An incredible group of people are putting together Turnabout, an Ace Attorney musical. An interpretation of the Turnabout musical project started all the way back in 2007, focusing more on a stage show style adaptation. I'm really excited to see this project come to fruition. I'm not being sponsored or anything, but please check it out when it drops soon, if you adore the series as much as I do. The Great Ace Attorney Resolve starts with Susato back in Japan, visiting the grave of Kazuma Asogi. Things immediately take a turn as Giselle Brett, the culprit from Case 1 in the first game, has been murdered before she could leave the country. Susato's close friend Rei is accused of this crime, and seeing as women aren't allowed to be lawyers given the time period, Susato has no other choice than to cross-dress as a boy, taking the name Ryutaro Naruhodo. Frankly, I'm slightly ashamed to admit this, but seeing Susato in that getup is pretty good and triggers some unnecessary feelings, if you know what I mean. What? You know it's true. It's And I'm not the only one. Rei is also smitten with Susato's appearance. It's no secret that Ace Attorney was heavily inspired by certain works of romantic fiction. See Thomas Game Doc's excellent video if you haven't already. And this case isn't subtle. Speaking of the case itself, Susato proves that the one who actually committed the crime was none other than an angry journalist called Raiten Menimemo, enraged at the idea of Giselle getting away with it and being triggered by her provocative taunting. He murks her. He murks her. Before being taken away, he claims that the Japanese government are trying to cover up some kind of shady deal with Britain. But before we can learn any more, the judge flips him over. Seishiro Jigoku is introduced as a real human being, which is somewhat rare in the series. The story subtly hints that he's not fond of Menimemo discussing government secrets. Overall, the case is short, sweet, and fun. And looking at Susato never gets old.
わかるよ。
大したことないよ。Case 2 is an oddity, being a flashback case taking place during the first game, which we apparently never realized happened until now. If his life couldn't get any worse, Soseki Natsume is once again accused of murder, shortly after being acquitted. This time, the victim is one William Shamspeare, who appears to have been poisoned. Natsume himself complains that he can't sleep well at all in his room, as if he's been strangled by a phantom in the night. I liked this case too, even if it had a lot of old familiar faces. Olive Green, the victim from Natsume's last case, after surviving a knife to the back, is involved once again. And mirroring the events that befell her, William Shamspeare appears to have survived being poisoned. It was intriguing to see two cases essentially have victims who didn't pass away and could even testify, sharing their side of the story. The narrative also sparked a great debate about how to best enjoy tea. I must side with Ryunosuke on this one. Drink tea while it's hot. Misato!
何？
温かいお茶と冷たいお茶とどちらの方が好き？
あったかいお茶。
そうだね。
何？この質問。
なんでもないです。
何？
大丈夫。
大丈夫？
William Shamspeare, being incredibly poor, as most actors are, hears of a treasure hidden in the apartment Natsume Soseki resides in. However, Natsume wasn't the first to live there. Olive Green's former husband lived there too, until he seemingly suffocated to death with no one to blame. Olive became convinced that his death was no accident, putting together that Shamspeare was blowing poisonous gas into the apartment above in order to flush the resident out and get his hands on the treasure. Upon realizing this, Olive hatched a plan to cover the pipe Shamspeare would need to use to blow in the gas. If he was innocent, then the poison wouldn't touch his lips, except it did. Shamspeare concedes that he didn't want to kill anyone, expecting the room's tenant to simply leave of their own accord. A tragic tale in which discovering the truth doesn't make anyone involved feel any better. The case ends with the discovery of the treasure sought after by Shamspeare hidden in the apartment. It appears to be a dog collar of sorts, covered in jewels, blood, and bearing the initial B. The relevance of this collar won't become apparent for a while yet, adding itself to the growing list of mysteries yet to be addressed from the first game. The third case returns us to modern-day London. Well, if your idea of modern is early 20th century England. A scientific symposium is being held in which inventors can show off their devices. Albert Harebrain claims to have invented a machine capable of teleportation. An investor of the machine, Odie Assman? That's his name. Okay. An investor of the machine, Odie Assman. Oh, it's awful. An investor of the machine, Odie Assman, steps inside. I'm not repeating that again. That's the take. That's the take I'm using. I'm sorry. I'll just call him Odie from now on if I can't contain myself. I apologize for being quite unprofessional. Odie Assman steps inside the teleportation device. However, something goes drastically wrong. After an explosion, Odie does appear to have teleported, except he's now a corpse. This case presents us with a great premise. The defendant wants to believe that he's responsible for the death of Odie Assman, as it would mean his invention was a success. In other words, he's against his own defense in regards to his innocence. The Great Ace Attorney Resolve continues this excellent trend of having unconventional defendants and victims, and I'm all for it. Ryunosuke, unable to practice law for several months, feeling compelled to continue as a defense attorney, asks Lord Strongheart for his permission to be a defense attorney once again. Surprisingly, his wish is granted, on the grounds that he takes up Harebrain's case. It's obvious that Strongheart has goals and motives that he's not sharing with you. Making Ryunosuke a lawyer again feels in some ways like something he expected to do. Regardless, Ryunosuke gets on the case with the help of Iris. He also reunites with Susato, who explains what happened with Giselle Brett. Susato learned two important things from Memo. That Giselle Brett's real name was Asashin, and that Asogi's body was never recovered. Lastly, Susato finally elaborates on how she knew the name of Herlock's adventure that supposedly no one had ever seen, The Hound of the Baskervilles. The title, alongside notes of the case, were present in her father's study back in Japan. Her and Ryunosuke wonder what her father was doing in the UK for the 6 years he resided there. During their investigation, they bump into Gina, who in a surprising twist has been taken under Gregson's wing as a rookie investigator. Seeing Gina get to do something with her life after being a pickpocket on the streets was really sweet. Her attitude may rub some people the wrong way, but it's important to remember that she's just a kid. Gregson's reasons for taking in Gina aren't initially clear, but even at this stage in the story, I started to get the impression that he felt compelled to take care of her, as if he was making up for something. Their chemistry together is also quite cute. With everyone working together, they discover that Odie Assman was actually the boss of a crime syndicate. Whether the machine could teleport a person or not, there appears to be a lot more to the case than meets the eye. As if things weren't mysterious enough, Van Zieks discloses that he used to be friends with the defendant, Albert Harebrain. It seems like he doesn't want him to be found guilty. I really adored that this case put a lot of spins on what characters desired. A defendant adamant that he is responsible, a prosecutor who doesn't want said defendant to be found guilty, and a defense attorney shaken by past experiences, unsure of what it means to be a lawyer. Van Zieks has more to share though. Lord Strongheart has given him an apprentice, a masked, hooded figure, who strikes both Ryunosuke and Susato with a sense of familiarity. It couldn't be him. There's just no way, right? Unfortunately, this apprentice is suffering from memory loss and has taken a vow of silence. Ryunosuke and Susato openly discuss that they believe Van Zeek's apprentice to be none other than Kazuma Asogi, although they have no way of proving it. The gang's investigation lead them to a wax museum run by a terrifyingly adorable Madame Two Spells, a parody of the real-world famous wax figure museum in London, Madame Two Swords. It appears that one of her wax figures has been stolen with a ransom note left behind. Sholmes is there, already investigating the case. Later, Ryunosuke confronts him about what went down on the SS Buria, asking why he hid the fact that Asogi is still alive. Sholmes dodges these questions, promising Ryunosuke that he'll get his answers soon. Herlock's actions feel true to the character he's based off. It always feels like he knows more than he's letting on, to the point where as a player, you're not sure if you can even trust him. We find out that the stolen wax figure doesn't depict any old person. It's a replica of a notorious serial killer who plagued the UK several years ago. His name is the Professor. The police did in fact detain the Professor, and he was sentenced to death. His trial was held in secret, and his identity kept anonymous. The knowledge of the Professor's identity was apparently too dangerous to reveal to the masses. It's assumed that doing so would cause some kind of public outrage. So how comes there's a one-to-one wax replica in Madame Two Spells' establishment? She explains that through shady means, she arranged to see the body and produce a wax figure shortly after his execution. To create intrigue and ensure that the British government don't come down on her, the wax model's face was sealed in an ironclad mask, which only she possesses the key for. The last place of interest the group visit is the office of a coroner called Courtney Sith. There are several things that don't add up about Odie Assman's body, but she insists there was nothing wrong with her autopsy report. Strangely, it appears that Courtney has been spending quite a large sum of money on basic necessities for her line of work, which shouldn't come at a hefty price. How all of this is relevant will become apparent soon enough. Through a thorough investigation, the gang identified the thief to be a peculiar-looking gentleman called Enoch Drebber, who also happens to be the man responsible for putting Harebrain's machine together. His argument is that he'd have nothing to gain by arranging this murder. In fact, he'd be losing financial income and probably damaging his own reputation. A compelling argument at face value, but Ryunosuke and company managed to uncover the truth. Drebber used to be a promising student of science, however also robbed graves on the side to make money, something that was practiced in real-world 20th century London. One fateful night, he decided to venture into the graveyard of the recently executed professor to harvest his organs while they were still fresh. What he found, however, shook him to his core. He claims to have seen the professor rising from the grave. Then there was a loud bang. What appeared to be a gunshot rang out, and the professor slunk back into his resting place. Drebber may have managed to flee the scene, but unfortunately for him, someone was privy to him being there. That someone was ex-journalist Odie. God damn it. That someone was the ex-journalist, Odie Assman. His allegations that Drebber was a grave robber tarnished his career and destroyed his future in science. This proved to be ample motive for him, but didn't explain the strange autopsy and appearance of the body. Naturally, the coroner Courtney Sith is summoned to testify on the matter, where she is also outed as being blackmailed by the Assman, explaining those strange payments. Apparently, Assman was blackmailing her for cash in order to keep secret her involvement with the Professor case. In fact, while Drebber planned the illusion which teleported Mr. Assman to his demise. It was actually Courtney who dealt the killing blow. I enjoyed chasing Drebber and found his appearance and demeanor to be really entertaining. Not to mention Courtney had a pretty cool design herself. The twists and turns of the case were engaging, and Harebrain, while disappointed that his machine didn't work, is relieved to be a free man. The case reveals one last thing though. Van Zeeks, in the presence of the professor's wax figure, elaborates that this murderer was responsible for killing his older brother, Clint Van Zeeks. A former chief prosecutor and by all accounts, someone with a very strong passion for law and order. He also reveals the professor's face, a Japanese gentleman, unfamiliar to Ryunosuke and Susato, although this explains Van Zeek's prejudice against the Japanese. Suddenly, His appearance triggers Van Ziek's apprentice to freak out, clutching his face. Our suspicions are proven correct. This man is Kazuma Asogi. I was really moved to see Asogi return. I adored his passion and strong will for the brief time that he was introduced to us. Plus, he's just really cute. The professor's face cures Asogi of his amnesia. This is no stranger. This man is his father, Genshin Asogi, a man who came to the UK several years ago alongside Susato's father and Judge Jigoku to study the UK's legal system. Kazuma finally reveals to Ryunosuke and Susato his main motivation for agreeing to come to the UK, to find out the truth and prove that his father was in fact not the notorious professor. Van Zieks adds that Strongheart was heavily involved in the professor case. And finally, Ryunosuke returns Karuma, the sword, to Asogi. The sword which was passed down through Kazuma's family for generations. All of a sudden, things are absolutely intriguing. I was on the edge of my seat with anticipation to see where it was going, and I didn't know who to trust. Who was Kazuma's father, Genshin? Was Kazuma's father Genshin truly a mass murderer? How was Susato's father and Judge Jigoku involved? Why was Clint Van Zieks the final victim? It could be argued that the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles tries to have too many mysteries running alongside each other at the same time, and all the while not really paying them off in a timely manner. For me personally, I played the game over a summer break last year. I could go at my own pace, and therefore had a pretty good time with it. But I wonder if other players would feel the same way. Susato's father, Yujin Mikotoba, and Judge Jigoku have made their way to the UK on international legal business. They take a cute group photo, which won't be relevant at all later on. Yujin explains to Ryunosuke and Susato that he couldn't believe it when Genshin Asogi turned out to be the professor. Genshin was an honorable legal scholar and friend. Judge Jigoku even broke a witness stand in a fit of rage regarding the case. In the end, the UK and Japan decided to cover up the event to not cause an international outrage or doubt in their legal systems. Meanwhile, Herlock is planning to join a group called the Redhead League in a private case and has dyed his hair appropriately. I'm not going to touch on this plotline a whole lot during this summary for two reasons. Number 1, it's not incredibly relevant to the overarching narrative. Number 2, it's not incredibly interesting. Visiting Lord Strongheart, he explains that they found Asogi with no memory stowed away on some boat, and that he personally asked Van Zieks to take care of him. Unfortunately, Asogi appears to have gone missing upon regaining his memories. This is quite worrying considering he only just returned. Shortly after, a lady called Evie Vigil shows up at Baker Street, saying that her husband, Daily Vigil, has gone missing, and that she'd like the world's greatest detective to get on the case. It turns out that several years ago, her husband worked at the prison near the cemetery which held the professor, aka Kazuma's father. It can't be a coincidence. Before anyone can start putting pieces of the cases together though, Gina appears with some shocking news. Tobias Gregson has been shot dead. The individual arrested? Barak Van Zieks. Naturally, Ryunosuke offers to defend him, but is shot down. Reminds me of another gloomy boy in a similar situation. Investigating the crime scene, Gregson was killed in an apartment full of notes and records related to the Redhead League and several prison inmates. There also appears to be a ginger wig, a gun, and 2 burnt-out candles. An intriguing mystery for sure. If things weren't crazy enough, Strongheart reveals that Asogi will be the prosecutor for reasons that'll become clear in time. Characters in this game really love withholding information from you until it best suits them. And I think that brings me to one of the weakest points of this game. The rate at which mysteries are introduced and pay off is completely out of whack. If it isn't evident from this review yet, the game expects you to be really patient. I truly believe this will be the great filter which determines if you're gonna enjoy this game or not. The sad part being that the payoffs are really good. Ryunosuke and Susato visit Barak Van Zieks once again in order to convince him to let them defend him and find out his side of the story. He theorizes that while Genshin Asogi is a demon from his past, Barak is Kazuma's, being one of the people responsible for sending his father to death. He suspects that Kazuma wants to prosecute him to avenge his father. Van Ziek says he only trusts people with a certain look in their eye, a burning desire for truth, a look he's only seen in 3 people: his brother Clint, Genshin Asogi, and Ryunosuke Naruhodo. While that is a truly touching sentiment, it only baffles things more that Genshin could have been a vicious serial killer if he was truly such a just man. To conclude this beautiful moment, Barak asks Ryunosuke to defend him, a request he accepts without hesitation. It's clear that the murder of Tobias Gregson and the following trial aims to resolve everything once and for all. Just like the Professor case, Van Ziek's trial is held in secret, with only elite members of the public in attendance. The Queen herself ordering affairs to be as such. Van Ziek claims he heard a gunshot and found Gregson's body. Asogi calls free local witnesses, Gossip, Venus, and Sandwich. Using Gregson's watch, Ryunosuke proves that the time of death is questionable, going on to prove that candles and gunpowder were used to create a fake gunshot. An obvious setup. Members from the Redhead League are summoned to testify about supposedly meeting Gregson. They confirmed that he was a detective via his ID and panicked, tying him up with a rope around his neck. Their recollection of the late inspector doesn't quite match up with his appearance. Gossip, however, just so happens to have a distinct rope-like mark around his own neck. We unmask this fellow and discover he's actually Daily Vigil, the missing husband and former worker at the prison which executed the professor. Long story short, while working at the prison, Daly was accused of trying to help the professor escape. These accusations drove him to attempt suicide. Needless to say, it was not successful. He stopped working at the prison, becoming a completely different person. Gregson would give Daly his ID and send him on secret assignments for cash, which he was happy to do. Investigating the Redhead League was his next mission. To the shock and horror of the court, they discovered that Daly was Gregson's alibi for his whereabouts, while he carried out assassinations on behalf of a higher authority. In the end, Gregson was a part of the Reaper of the Bailey, who wouldn't let criminals found not guilty continue to live. This revelation unsurprisingly causes a stir, halting proceedings until a later time. Meanwhile, Van Ziek opens up a little more about his memories of Genshin Asogi. Apparently, the Japanese scholar once saved Barak's life, and he could never understand his motivations for becoming the professor. Furthermore, he notes that the professor seemed to exclusively target corrupt politicians, making him out to be almost an anti-hero of sorts. Ryunosuke and Susato catch up with her father, Yujin, and press him to finally open up about his past. They ask him if he'd ever met a John Wilson, who they assume to be Iris's late father and Shom's former partner. Vaguely, Yujin informs the duo that he doesn't recall John Wilson ever having a daughter, nor did he accompany Herlock on any of his cases. More importantly, Judge Jigoku appears to have gone missing. But with not much time to ponder on that, the two of them head to interrogate Daily Vigil. They learn from him that someone in the prison did in fact help the professor escape, although he's not sure who. He reminds Ryunosuke that Courtney Sif was the coroner at the time, inspiring him and Susato to pay her office another visit. With Courtney in custody, they bump into her daughter, who is also fond of autopsies, Maria Gori. Naturally, she's not happy to see the people responsible for her mother's incarceration. Despite this, she fills them in that Lord Strongheart personally asked her to keep Gregson's time of death ambiguous. Maria, not wanting to go down the same path as her mother, tells you her true feelings. She believes that Gregson died much earlier, based on some moldy fish and chips in his coat pocket, although she suspects his actual body was refrigerated somehow. They also discover another shocking revelation. John Wilson was the coroner in charge of Clint Van Ziek's autopsy, during which he found Genshin Asogi's ring inside Clint's stomach. This was the evidence used to make a case against him. Returning to Baker Street, Ryunosuke and Susato find a masked figure lying across the sofa. Sholmes claims that Iris is hiding something, and deduces the person on the sofa to be the King of Germany. Of course, this is hogwash, and they discover him to be Yuji Mikotoba, Susato's father. He'd been knocked out by a boxing glove trap guarding Sholmes' adventure manuscripts. Once everyone comes back to their senses, Iris explains that the signature on John Wilson's autopsy reports matched the notes made by Herlock's former partner, the man she assumes to be her dad. She's shocked when it's pointed out, however, that said signature didn't really match the contents of the autopsy report. In fact, it belongs to none other than Yuji Mikotoba, who studied and worked alongside John Wilson at the time. He also reveals that he lived and worked with one Herlock Sholmes. Eugene was Herlock's partner and close companion all along, coming as a huge shock to everyone. This is an excellent twist and really caught me off guard during my first playthrough. This means that Iris's family members are still a complete mystery, with Herlock not elaborating any further. Prior to proceedings, Iris gives Ryunosuke a cute rabbit doll, instructing him to pull its ears should all hope be lost. Entering the courtroom, we are shocked to find that Lord Strongheart has replaced the judge, demonstrating how much power this man has over current affairs. Off the bat, Ryunosuke proves that Asashin, aka Giselle Brett, was working for Gregson, adding more evidence that he was part of the Reaper of the Bailey. Before this can be explored, they make a more shocking discovery. A piece of Asogi's sword, Karuma, inside Gregson's luggage, alongside slash marks. Asogi admits that he was with Gregson, and that they were on a mission to assassinate Judge Jigoku. It appears that the Reaper of the Bailey is looking to eliminate all loose ends connected with the Professor case. No one knows where Judge Jigoku is now. Ryunosuke and Susato are appalled to hear that Asogi transpired to be part in this assassination. However, he reassures them he had no intention of killing anyone. Out of options, Ryunosuke pulls the ears of the rabbit provided to him by Iris. Unbelievably, Herlock's voice can be heard on the other end. It turns out to be some kind of primitive portable radio, a cute invention I can suspend my disbelief to see incorporated into the story. Sholmes and Mikotoba discover Judge Jigoku hiding on a ship in an entertainingly strange dance of deduction. I find it morbidly hilarious to imagine Eugene tap dancing in the presence of a recently deceased corpse, but I digress. Jigoku explains that he feels like people are attempting to kill him, and he wasn't wrong. It's revealed that the names on the discs from the first game were assassins, A. Shin, K. Asogi, alongside their targets, J. Wilson, T. Gregson. In other words, Gregson was Asogi's mark in an international scheme to get rid of those involved with the Professor case. Jigoku takes the stand and testifies that Gregson tried to kill him on the ship. He defended himself, incapacitating Gregson, but didn't kill him. Asogi agrees with this, claiming that Gregson returned to London where he was murked by Van Zieks. Ryunosuke manages to prove using the suitcase that the body had been moved, making that photo they took earlier official evidence. Jigoku amends his testimony that he did in fact move the body, but accuses Asogi of killing him. However, Asogi had already left, his signature and sign-in time at a local lodgings, giving him a solid alibi. Cornered, Jigoku breaks the witness stand and finally concedes to the murder of Tobias Gregson. He stored the body in an onboard freezer and tried to transplant the crime scene. Jigoku laments that all of these assassination plots and attempts on his life were the work of the high-ranking members in the British government. Of course, he's shut down by Strongheart, who prepares to make his ruling on the case and end things here. When it all appears to be over, Asogi objects. He demands to prosecute Barak Van Zieks for sending his father to his execution, insisting that he wasn't the Professor. Asogi reveals that he paid Gregson a visit, threatening him for information on the Professor case with his sword Karuma, hence the broken piece and the slash marks in his suitcase. Gregson admitted to Asogi that the autopsy of Clint Van Zieks was bogus. Kazuma adds that Van Zieks was the prosecutor, and only he had the power to fake an autopsy report. That's when it's revealed that Lord Strongheart was the lead prosecutor on that case at the time. Strongheart replies that this is all baseless conjecture, looking to end the trial there and then. Fortunately though, Herlock and Eugene arrive and share with the court that Eugene was working alongside John Wilson at the time, and that he can confirm if the autopsy was fraudulent or not. The members of the gallery cheer and demand justice. so Strongheart begrudgingly lets Yujin testify. He shares that Clint was killed by a sword, whereas the professor would often use a large dog to conduct his killings. Also, the evidence used to convict Genshin was his ring, found in Clint's stomach. However, this always struck Yujin as odd, not only because Clint would go out of his way to swallow his assailant's ring, but also as the ring's design would almost certainly scratch and damage him internally, given its shape. Kazuma demands why his father wouldn't fight back against accusations of being the professor, and they conclude that Genshin had some kind of secret weapon protecting him, ensuring that he be granted some kind of escape. The guards working at the prison testify that they recall Genshin writing something in his cell prior to his execution, but no papers were found on him or in said cell. The only item he had on him was his sword, Karuma, which he was allowed to hang on to out of respect for his culture, considering he was chained up and guarded by armed officers. It wasn't perceived as a threat. Ryunosuke, Susato, Kazuma, and Barrack finally come to an absolutely earth-shattering realization. Genshin Asogi was not the professor. It was Clint Van Zieks, Barrack's older brother. Strongheart confirms this to be the case, adding that if the general public knew such an elite member of the established government was a vigilante serial killer, the uproar could be disastrous for the country. Clint apparently came to the conclusion that to rid evil, one must become evil, using his hound to prey on corrupt individuals who evaded the law. Genshin Asogi put together that Clint was the professor and confronted him. Clint was tired of being a killer and asked Genshin to duel him. In other words, he requested to die at the hands of someone he knew. Genshin obliged his request, apparently receiving a full confession and will from Clint before his death. This information protected him as he threatened to release it should he not be allowed safe passage back to Japan. Strongheart mocks this idea though, claiming there was never any confession or will. Kazuma though recalls getting a letter from his late father, a letter suggesting that Karuma is more significant than he thinks. Ryunosuke and Kazuma open up the hilt of Karuma to find several documents. Alas, after all these years, Clint's confession reveals itself. It also accuses Strongheart of being one of the masterminds behind the killings. In response to this, Strongheart says he did what was necessary to strengthen and protect the judicial system. That you have to fight fire with fire, and there was no other way. To the shock and horror of Ryunosuke and company, the elites in the gallery cheer and support Strongheart's declaration. Strongheart adds that despite this, he did not kill Genshin Asogi during his prison escape. In fact, it was Judge Jigoku. Clint, sick of being the professor, requested to die in a duel with Genshin, who obliged. Strongheart and the other higher-ups conspired to blame Genshin for the killings, as to not spark mistrust between the public and the government. Genshin, however, threatens to publish Clint's last will and testament, negotiating an escape plan. When Strongheart and Jigoku arrive at the graveyard to assist in said escape, they find Dreba already unearthing his coffin. In a panic, Strongheart yells at Jigoku to take a shot, or everything would be over. Whether he was aiming for Dreber, Genshin, or otherwise, Genshin Asogi was shot and died then and there, Dreber fleeing the scene. Unbelievably, despite the truth finally coming out, it didn't matter. This trial was being held in secret. Just when it seems like all hope is lost, something absolutely bizarre happens. And I'm not making this up. Herlock Sholmes appears as a hologram and parades around the court. Not only can his incredible invention create and broadcast real holograms, but it also live streams the case to the Queen of England. We never see or hear from her, but Sherlock insists that upon viewing the whole situation, the Queen has demanded Strongheart be stripped of his position and charged with conspiracy and corruption. I'm of two minds of how this plays out. On one hand, I think it's goofy as hell, and there's a running theme of scientific progress making the world a better place. Yet, it's a little out of nowhere, and I suppose I would have preferred a more grounded conclusion. Not that Ace Attorney hasn't had spirits of the dead, faceless men, parrots, and whales testify before. I lean towards this Deus Ex Machina being deserved, as the mystery of the professor was really exciting to see play out. Strongheart, finally defeated after all of his disgusting behavior and manipulations, literally explodes in one of the best breakdowns in the series. I don't use the word literally very often. It's finally over. The spirits of the professor case can finally rest. Kazuma and Barak make peace with each other in a rather touching moment. They both lost family members they loved and somehow managed to avenge them. Eugene has one last thing to tell the others regarding Clint. He'd actually had an affair with a lady of the Baskervilles establishment who passed away during birth. A secret child Eugene was asked to take care of. This child was Iris, making her Barak's niece and finally giving her closure on her parents. These characters could never have imagined how important they would be to each other, and grew from the love and friendship they shared. The Baker Street gang may not have been related by blood, but they were a family. Seeing them go through trials and tribulations gave me more appreciation for the folks in my own life. Ryunosuke Naruhodo decides to return back to Japan and pursue a career as a defense attorney. He has learned what it means to believe in your client and pursue truth. Kazuma Asogi decides to stay as Van Ziek's apprentice, the two of them putting their pasts behind them to create a brighter future. Asogi asks Ryunosuke to hold on to Karuma, an incredible request considering the sword is supposed to represent his very soul. If you support the idea that Ryunosuke and Kazuma should be more than friends, I wouldn't blame you. I certainly believe another duo of fictional lawyers belong together. Susato Mikotoba is still formally Kazuma's judicial assistant, but at the last minute, she requests to return to Japan with Ryunosuke. She explains that she wants to be by his side and follow him into the future together. Spoiler alert, but their pairing is something I subscribe to as well. The game keeps things vague enough to let the player decide who they feel belongs together, as any good visual novel should. Sholmes and Iris say their heartfelt goodbyes, and Herlock performs his last bow. Ryunosuke and Kazuma go their separate ways. However, they are bound by a stronger force of nature, their destinies forever intertwined. And that's the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. I hope this review has illustrated my conflicted emotions regarding the game. The pacing might be a bit off, but I really did fall in love with the characters and everything else the game had to offer. In some ways, Ryunosuke is a flat character. He starts off his adventure already being honest with a good heart. However, throughout his journey, he affects the world around him and makes it a better place. I'm sure I'll revisit the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles someday in the future. But for now, I think I have to go my own way. I would love to hear your thoughts and feelings on the game in the comments, so please leave them below. And until the next time, this is Jack's Melancholy Palace, signing out. Thanks for watching.